argumentation is based around the idea that if only there was some way to trick the oppressors into oppressing less, or get them to oppress less, that somehow all these things will be solved, we think it's problematic. When we recognize the way in which specifically this kind of systematic oppression operates, we recognize that simply fiating that money will be distributed differently isn't satisfactory in a world where attempts to redistribute wealth differently have been met with failure. We think this supply-side approach to oppression is not the way to solve things. Rather, recognizing that money signals agency and signals self-expression, we think that's what we should be focused on giving back. Two areas of clash, one on the more principled level, what is taxation policy, why we think this is profoundly justified, and secondly, though, and more substantially on pragmatism, does this make things better? Before I get there, a little rebuttal. So the big thing coming out of second op is that the value of money is the ability to buy things, an expression of will, an expression of self-worth. Exactly. Money is an expression of agency. That's what makes this solution better than trying to simply grant people more access to other things. Because in this case, we signal, in your case, you're signaling that your problems are because you simply don't have this good. And if we give this good to you, that your problems will disappear. What we signal, though, is that your problems come when you do not have access to the feeling of self-worth, where you do not have access to your agency. And by signaling that, we recognize that the problems faced are a result of a larger oppressive group preventing you from acting upon your agency and preventing you from enacting what you believe. But when that becomes the signal, we disassociate oppression from ideas of being unable and conflate it rather with times when people are able to do what they otherwise would. Moving on, though, principled question, principles of taxation. There are two perspectives that we use when we think about taxation under both they justify. First, progressive taxation. We tax people differently based on economic standing because we recognize that people are burdened in different ways. When that is our conception of taxation, this clashes directly with opening opposition's claims that poor whites need help too, Jay-Z does not. Our response is fairly simple, it's that intersectionality exists. People face oppression for a number of reasons. Yes, poor white people do need things. We're not contesting that. But when we compare a poor white person to an equally poor Latino, we recognize that the scale of oppression is worse for those who are oppressed based on economic standing, in addition to being oppressed based on racial standing. And in the same way, we say that Jay-Z, though he is not oppressed economically, is likely oppressed more than someone like Eminem or Conan O'Brien. Because we recognize that oppression operates in degrees, not in a true or false sense, we recognize that there are simply more burdens placed upon someone of color, placed upon a sexual minority, than someone who is equal to them on economic standards. It's justified on that conception. But secondly, the second conception of taxation is it's based on what you receive. Taxation is a transaction. That part of your income is exchanged for public goods. And this clashes again with open opposition when they say that we should simply reallocate funds. But it fails because the idea under their conception is that the funds are there, so they're being allocated poorly. Untrue, though. In New York City, there are lots of firefighters. The fact that response times are far higher for black communities than white ones isn't a factor of there not being enough firefighters. It's racist implementation of policies that exist. Police exist, but it really feels like people of color don't go to the police to feel safe. It's not a problem of funds not being there. There are funds to provide these things for communities of color. It's the implementation that's the problem. The point is, you can throw as much money as you want to this, but you're not going to get the same level of solvency as simply giving people more money in their pockets, allowing them to make the kind of long-term plans Kamara outlines, of making them able to do this kind of thing. So under that conception of taxation, we recognize that when people do not have access to the public goods that their taxation supposedly allows them, we recognize that taxation is unjustified. Under both systems of taxation, we think Gov wins. Okay.
If your case is about access to economic opportunity, a poor white woman is an oppressed group, but also has more access to economic opportunity than a poor black guy. Why should they pay the same lower tax rates?
Okay, that is why everyone on Gov has been in support of taxing people who are poor less than taxing people who are rich, because they face burdens in a way wealthy people do not. It is the same justification for people of equal wealth who face oppression in other ways. I would say that The point of Doug's case is that when we compare a poor white woman to perhaps a poor Latino woman, we would tax a Latino woman less. We would also say that we would tax a poor woman less than a poor man in the same racial group, because women are also an oppressed minority of society. We are in favor of all of these things. Okay. Second thing, pragmatism though, do we actually solve? Because the big thing coming out of opposition is this will simply have backlash. People will perceive it as a racial thing, and that will simply not solve it. This entire case is aggressively non-unique. This would be a side effect of any policy reform. When they get up here and say that we should allocate funds differently, people who are losing out on these fund allocations are also going to have backlash, or are also going to react differently. And let's talk about what this backlash would look like in comparison to the backlash that would happen in our world. In your world, they would become the wealthy versus less wealthy. And we think that's a very problematic distinction because of the intense power inequality between those of wealth and those who are not. And when the wealthy see the less wealthy as oppositional group, it becomes much easier for these people to justify their use of this economic power to cast out the poor. Rather, the backlash, let's compare that to the backlash in our world. In our world, it's likely to look an awful lot like the status quo, in which racial minorities do not receive that which economic minorities of the same wealth of the majority identity group have it. But what does this imply, though? If people take it as a more racial question, it means there's less opposition for the poor within identity majorities to get the things they need. So if you are worried about the poor white person, sure, they will marginally benefit. But it also mitigates the extent to which these identity-based minorities are harmed by their lack of access. Because they are going to, yes, lack some access after this policy, but the harm that that entails is going to be smaller when they have a greater ability to have their own agency based internally, rather than depending upon the government giving them things, which is what you're advocating. But it also means they can create more political advocacy. Because having money in your pockets is one of the things that allows you to get politically engaged. So if we're looking at the long-term nature of the political system, we have to recognize that even in cases where access is still not equal, when you have money, you can change that further down the road.
All right, we are Bill remarks, and I will now